So from the mid 18th century to the beginning of the 20th century, we see many of those Latin American countries start to gain independence from their European colonizers. Now, when I talk about Latin America, I'm talking about Central America, I'm talking about South America, and I'm talking about the Caribbean. Okay. All right. So indigenous peoples and civilizations populated Latin America prior to European arrival. We talked about some of the more prominent ones, like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca. Remember when Columbus shows up in the Caribbean, there are Arawak, Caribs, and Taínos. Um, European colonization, in some cases, completely annihilates those indigenous civilizations or subjugates them, enslaves them, but basically supplants them. And your principal colonizers in Latin America are Spain, Portugal, and France. All right, but some things have been happening. We had the American Revolution in 1776. We had the French Revolution in 1789 and the spread of Enlightenment ideas about the relationship between people and their governments. And then Napoleon is doing all sorts of things in Europe in the 1800s. So there's all sorts of things going on that are going to stoke the fires of revolution in Latin America. And we'll look at some examples. So these are causes of Latin American independence in the 18th and 19th century. Spain sets up colonies in Americas. We talked about that. You have Creoles and mestizos who grow discontented with Spanish rule. So these are people who are uh, indigenous people and Spanish people, indigenous people and other European groups intermarried and mixed. And so you have some people that are not at the bottom of the social hierarchy, but not at the top, and they're upset with the status quo with Spanish rule. You have Enlightenment ideas spreading to the Americas. We saw how like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and all of these, Voltaire and influenced revolutionary thought in the New World. All right. Revolutions occurring in North America and France are going to inspire leaders in these countries to revolt as well. Spain is going to weaken as an empire, and leaders in Latin America are going to recognize that and take advantage of that moment to attain independence. Spain's going to try to restore authority in the colonies, but that's only going to prompt more resistance, and strong leaders will call for independence. So you're going to get wars of independence. A lot of people are going to die, but nations of Latin America will win independence. They'll write new constitutions. Much like us, they'll fight over, what those new governments should look like. You're going to have powerful landowners called caudillos who are going to take power, and new nations are going to become economically dependent. All right. So caudillos are strong military leaders. A lot of these guys are big landowners. They are going to impose dictatorships, as in totalitarian regimes. All right. As these nations modernize, they will become economically dependent, so on Western European markets. And so you'll end up with kind of something called economic imperialism. And certainly the United States is going to play a role in that. The United States is going to practice all sorts of, well, political and economic imperialism during during this time period. We'll talk about something called the Monroe Doctrine, but essentially, U.S. foreign policy stated that the United States was like the big brother of Latin America. It was introduced in 1823 under President Monroe, and it essentially said Europeans should not colonize anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, that they shouldn't try to install kings and queens or viceroyalties or any kind of, any kind of influence in the Western Hemisphere. And that if they did that, according to the Monroe Doctrine, that would be an act of war. And we kind of told Europe, hey, if you stay out of the Western Hemisphere, we'll stay out of Europe. We didn't want to get involved there. But then later on, you get what's called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially says the U.S. reserves the right to interfere in Latin American countries, to preserve democracy for the sake of humanity, etc. What it really comes down to is money. So, for example, the United Fruit Company, which is now known as Dole, was like the evil king of Latin America in the 19th and 20th century. United Fruit owned all the land. So the people that actually lived in these, what they call banana republics, places like Guatemala, the people that lived there didn't own any of the land. They just worked on United Fruit Company plantations for pennies. You can imagine this is going to create some discontent. And so later on, we're going to see a lot of these Latin American countries nationalizing that land. They're going to take that land from the United Fruit Company and give it back to the people. When Cuba does that, it causes us to get really mad at Castro and spend a few decades trying to get rid of him during the Cold War. He was also communist, and we never quite managed it. And so this phrase, this Banana Republic phrase, is used to designate supposedly politically unstable countries that are dependent on limited agriculture and ruled by small, wealthy, corrupt cliques that were put in power by the United States. A really good example of that is Batista. Batista ruled Cuba. Batista ruled Cuba because the United States made sure that Batista could rule Cuba. We helped him out, we gave him money and support. In exchange, he was able to maintain power until he wasn't. Castro overthrew him. We still tried to back Batista. Batista was bad for the Cuban people, but good for U.S. business. The United States CIA is going to get very involved in Latin America. We are going to make a lot of mistakes. So we're going to install dictatorial rulers because they're seen as anti-communist or good for U.S. business. So bad people like Augusto Pinochet, the United States, via the CIA, is going to install as leaders in Latin America. And that has ramifications today. So the reason why there's some anti-American sentiment there is because of those actions that we took. Anyway, back to independence. So you have French colonies in Latin America, and what is known as today, was known as Haiti today, was Saint Domingue back then, and it's sort of the western portion of the island of Hispaniola. So like this is the Dominican Republic, this is Haiti today, okay? And so the Haitian side here, all right, was a French colony, and they grew sugar cane, and they practiced plantation slavery. And so it's under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave. He was self-educated, trained in Enlightenment thought. All right, he didn't have a lot of military or political experience, but he became a very adept general and diplomat. He quickly becomes the leader in a large-scale revolt in Haiti. So he took leadership of the slave revolt in 1791 and eventually is leading a revolt that involved 100,000 slaves in Haiti. All right. Louverture himself was born in 1801 in the Spanish Santo Domingo. That's the eastern side that we call the Dominican Republic today. In 1802, French troops landed. All right. Toussaint agreed to an end of fighting if the French would end slavery. But the French accused him of planning another uprising. Eventually, he was exiled to a prison in the French Alps and died there, but his lieutenant went on to continue the fight, and Haiti did win its independence. So this is Toussaint's general, his lieutenant, who took up the fight after he died. And on January 1st, 1804, Haiti is declared an independent country. Haiti meaning mountainous land, and that is the language of the Arawak. Remember the Arawak. So Columbus was the first one to really land in Hispaniola and sort of begin to colonize it, and the Arawak were wiped out. And he ends up becoming, so Jean-Jacques de Salin becomes the first emperor of Haiti. And by 1820, Haiti is an independent republic. All right. So that is really significant because it's the first free black republic, and it is also the second free republic in the Western Hemisphere. Um, and and if you take my U.S. history class, you'll hear me talk about this. But Haiti's history is tied up very closely to that of the United States because Haitians will influence enslaved African Americans to also rebel. And they were so influential and so known to cause American slaves to also seek independence and freedom that actually Southern politicians tried to get Thomas Jefferson to ban trade with Haiti. Of course, he didn't do it. But if a Haitian ship pulled into harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, the Haitian sailors were not allowed to leave the dock area because the slave owners were absolutely terrified that their slaves might talk to these Haitians and get that revolutionary bug, which is kind of interesting because those very same slave owners claim that enslaved African Americans weren't capable of doing something like that intellectually, right? But at the same time, they're like, don't let them get around the Haitians because they might rebel. So it just goes to show you. All right. So there are also Spanish colonies where we're going to have revolutions. So, and you need to understand a little bit about the rigid social system that exists in these Spanish colonies. So you have what are called Iberian Spanish or Peninsular Spanish. Spain is a peninsula. So if you're peninsular, that means you were born in Spain. So you're the elite of the elite. You hold the highest offices. Creoles were Spanish who were born in Latin America. So they're the officers in the army. They often resent the power of peninsulars. Mestizos are people of mixed European and native descent. Now, this next term you're going to run into, and so I have it here, and it's mulatto, and it is people of mixed European and African. I do want to point out, though, that this is not an appropriate term to use to refer to somebody of mixed European and African descent. You don't really hear it used anymore. It does show up in the textbook, and it shows up in some American history textbooks, but it actually has a lot of racist connotations. You'll note the root word is mule, and that should tell you enough about what this word meant. So it's not something that you would use to refer to somebody of mixed European and African ancestry today, but do be aware that that's the term that was used. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have the native people, the indigenous people, their descendants, rather. So this rigid social system is going to be the source of a lot of discontent, basically from here down, right? And so the Peninsular Spanish have got to go. All right. So Napoleon invades Spain in 1808. He removed Spain's King Ferdinand VII and made his brother the King of Spain. And the Creoles say, hey, guess what? That's all the signal we need. It's time for revolution. So in 1810, you get rebellion across Latin America. Napoleon defeats Ferdinand. Napoleon was defeated, rather. We talked about that already. And Ferdinand returns to power, but it's too late. The Creoles are going to continue their movement. All right. And so, despite efforts to stop that, we're gonna have some folks emerge that are going to become very powerful leaders. So Simon Bolivar is one of the most well-known independence leaders in South America. He was a Venezuelan Creole. He'll become known as the Liberator. All right. So Venezuela declares independence in 1811. At first, Bolivar's armies are not successful, but they're actually able to execute kind of a clever maneuver. They march across the Andes into what is today known as Colombia and take the Spanish army by surprise by doing that. They kind of come from behind. And in 1821, Venezuela achieves independence. And then Bolivar's forces march north to Ecuador, where they link up with Jose de San Martin. Now they have a combined force. De San Martin is a modest man. He was born in Argentina and trained as a military officer in Spain. So he has a lot of military experience. There's a statue that is in Lima, Peru. Um, and so Argentina declares independence in 1816. San Martin led his army across the Andes to Chile, where they joined with Bernardo O'Higgins and freed Chile. In Ecuador in 1822, San Martin meets with Bolivar to decide how to remove the remaining Spanish forces from Lima. So you can see things are happening rapidly. Just a year later, Monroe is going to issue that Monroe Doctrine, where essentially the United States will say that the Europeans need to get the heck out of the Western Hemisphere. So we're supporting the independence of Latin American countries from Europe, but it's for our own benefit, all right, for our own economic benefit to increase our sphere of influence. So San Martin sailed for Europe and died on French soil in 1850. Bolivar defeated the Spanish at the Battle of Ayacucho. All right, so Bolivar, you can see, and then San Martin working simultaneously. Okay, so Bolivar's vision was a united South America. All right, and he carved out, Grand Colombia. That's Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. This, though, was short-lived. You had a lot of factionalism. You had a lot of dissent. All right. So Bolivar eventually resigns, and eventually Grand Colombia in 1830 is divided into Colombia, Ecuador, and Venezuela. Later on, Panama is going to split from Colombia. So the United States encourages Panama to split from Colombia. We support Panamanian independence because we just really believe in independence and all that good stuff, right? Not quite. Where is Panama? Let me see if I can grab my select tool here, and if not, no, I can't do it. But anyway, Panama sits at a very strategic point. It's on an isthmus. It's that narrow connection between South America and Central America, and it's a perfect spot to build the Panama Canal. So we encouraged Panama to declare independence from Colombia because we wanted to build the Panama Canal. We signed a treaty to build the canal. It's a very strategic waterway. And so you can see up here, Panama was part of Colombia. We're going to get them to declare independence. We're going to build the Panama Canal. That's to our benefit. So we weren't just in it for the good of the Panamanians. In Mexico, you have Indians and mestizos, not Creoles, who are going to play a key role in the independence movement. So Creoles want to avoid violence. The lower classes are rebelling, and much like in France, things are getting really bloody. The lower classes are rebelling against the upper classes, and so the Creoles want to avoid that violence, so they side with Spain, at least until 1820. All right. Important leader that emerges is Miguel Hidalgo. He's a village priest, and he believes in Enlightenment ideals, things like natural rights, the social contract, right? And so in 1810, he called for revolution. All right, Grito de Dolores means call for revolution. His Indian and Mestizo followers march on Mexico City. And a Spanish army, with the assistance of Creoles, attacks and defeats Hidalgo in 1811. All right, and then emerges Jose Maria Morelos, and he is going to take control after Hidalgo's defeat. He is also defeated by the Creoles. In 1820, revolution in Spain put a very liberal government in power. And Mexican Creoles were kind of concerned that they were going to lose the influence that they once had. So they kind of saw the writing on the wall and they switched sides. They unite against Spain. All right. Augustine Iturbide declared himself emperor but was overthrown. And in 1824, you get the establishment of the Mexican Republic. So Mexico declares independence in 1821. By 1824, they've established a republic. All right. So Mexico's Congress follows the wishes of the liberals and starts to write an institution for a federal republic. But the Criollos still disagreed on how the Constitution should be written. This term Criollos, by the way, is just another term for Creoles. So remember, Creoles are of mixed European and native ancestry. So you had conservative groups that wanted a strong central government and Roman Catholicism to be the national religion, just like it was under Spanish rule. You had liberal leaders who wanted the central government to have less power and the states to have more, and they wanted freedom of religion. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because we have some similar perspectives developed in the early United States about the whether there should be a strong or a weak national government, more states' rights and individual liberty, etc. So these groups reach a compromise, though it's not supported by a lot of Creoles. In 1824, Mexico becomes a republic with a president. They had a bicameral legislature, that's a two-house Congress heading the national government. They had governors heading the states, and they had state legislatures. And the first president was Guadalupe Victoria. This should sound familiar. It's very similar to the government put in place following the American Revolution. That separation of powers that you see, the states' rights versus federal government issues are all very similar. Okay. And so out of all this emerges a strong military leader named Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. So he's a caudillo, he's a strong-armed ruler. He fought for independence from Spain in 1821 and again in 1829 when Spain tries to reconquer Mexico. And he's president of Spain 4 times between 1833 and 1855. He kept kind of switching sides to keep himself in power. And he ends up becoming emperor of the largest empire in world history, stretching from southern Mexico through Texas, all of what is now the U.S. Southwest, California, some of our Oregon, and a huge amount of territory. But he's only emperor for a short time. Remember, when you take my U.S. history class, we talk a little more about Santa Anna. He leads an army up to put down the Texan war for independence. The Texans were making a play for independence. Mexican authority was becoming more centralized. The Texans revolted. There's, of course, the famous Battle of the Alamo. The Texans win their independence at the Battle of San Jacinto under the command of General Sam Houston. And Mexico loses the province of Texas, more or less. But later on, in 1848, they're going to fight a war with the United States and lose the entire northern half of their territory with a treaty called the Mexican Cession. But that's a little beyond what we talk about. So the Texas Revolt was in 1820s. Mexico, the Texas province belonged to Mexico, but it was sparsely populated. So the Mexican government was encouraging English-speaking settlers to migrate there. The land was cheap. A lot of people went, but eventually they wanted self-government. All right. And so one of their leaders, the Texan leader, Stephen Austin, starts to encourage revolt. And in 1836, Santa Anna is defeated by the Texan army. So a lot of times when we think about the Texas Revolt, we think about the Alamo. It's important to remember that the Alamo was a defeat for the Texans. And the Alamo was a Spanish mission where all like these, not all, but a small group of a few hundred Texans kind of holed up. And Santa Anna's army surrounded the Alamo, and they fought to the last man, mostly to the last man. They all died, but it became a rallying cry for Texas independence. And then in 1836, at the Battle of San Jacinto on the San Jacinto Plain. The Texan army under the command of Sam Houston defeats Santa Anna. And then Texas remains an independent republic for 9 years. And the U.S. ends up annexing Texas in 1845 and then provokes a war with Mexico. And then in 1848, the U.S. signs the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which basically the United States gets the entire northern half of Mexico. So this is basically the entire U.S. Southwest plus California. It's an area bigger than Western Europe. All right. And then you can see, so there was the Texas annexation first. Texas won its independence in 1836 and was annexed by the U.S. in 1845. Then, following its victory over Mexico in 1848, the U.S. gets this entire swath of territory here, the whole Southwest. All right. Benito Juarez, he was a poor orphan Zapotec Indian. He had a law degree. He was a local governor, and he leads a reform movement where the idea is to redistribute land, take it from the traditional landholders and redistribute it to the people. He fought for the separation of church and state and fought for education. He was exiled by Santa Anna, but he set up a liberal government. He was just plagued by conservative rebels. All right. Those conservative rebels actually conspire with France to reconquer Mexico. Napoleon III sends armies to Mexico. All right, and it's out of this conflict that we get Cinco de Mayo, the 5th of May, the Independence Day, or not necessarily the Independence Day, but the day that celebrates a very famous victory over a symbolic sort of moment, if you will, of Mexican victory at the Battle of Puebla against the French. The French won the war, but this was a very, important victory, important symbolic victory over the French. Napoleon III appoints one of his relatives, Austrian Archduke Maximilian, as Emperor of Mexico, but Juarez continues to resist. Eventually, the U.S. sends troops to Mexico, and the French give up in 1867. Juarez continued his reform movement. All right. In the 1870s, another strong military leader, another caudillo emerges, and that is Porfirio Diaz. He's also an Indian. He rose up through the ranks. He was supported by other Indians and small landowners, and of course the military. He's a strong military leader, remember. He was for order and progress, but liberty is going to be limited under his leadership. So as a result of Diaz's sort of restrictive policies, you're going to get a collection of revolutionaries that are going to fight the Mexican Revolution. Pancho Villa, Zapata, Madero, and Huerta will rise up to fight against Diaz. Pancho Villa enacts kind of a Robin Hood policy, take from the rich, give to the poor, especially in terms of land. Zapata is going to fight for land and freedom. Madero will be appointed president, but will eventually resign and be murdered. Huerta will take the presidency. However, Villa and Zapata are going to support somebody else named Carranza, and they will overthrow Huerta. So Carranza will eventually murder Zapata. In 1917, a new constitution will be drawn up, the same one that's in use today. Carranza will eventually be overthrown by Alvaro Obregón. We will also see revolutions against Portuguese rule. Remember the Treaty of Tordesillas that moved that line of demarcation west and basically split the Atlantic between Spain and Portugal in 1494. Portugal was mostly focused on routes to Asia in the 15th, 16th centuries, but remember they're going to end up controlling Brazil. So Brazilian independence is going to come in 1807. Napoleon, remember, invades Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, forcing the Portuguese royal family of King John VI to escape to Brazil. This is Portugal's largest colony. From 1807 to 1815, Brazil becomes the center of the Portuguese Empire. Eventually, Napoleon is defeated, as we discussed. So in 1815, remember, Napoleon is defeated, and Portugal wanted Brazil to become a colony again. But they're not going to want to do that. By 1822, you had Creoles demanding independence. All right? And they sign a petition. They say they want Portugal's Prince Dom Pedro to rule Brazil. And Dom Pedro agrees. He declares Brazil an independent state. And he becomes Emperor Pedro I. He wants to emulate Napoleon, all right, and unify Brazil. And so he had some, some political issues. His popularity started to go into decline. He had some personal problems. So eventually his decline in popularity leads to, problems with his government and dissatisfaction among all levels of Brazilians. And in 1889, his successor is overthrown and Brazil becomes an independent republic. So essentially what we see is a domino effect. Numerous Central American states declare independence for both Spain and Mexico and create the United Province of Central America. So by 1841, the United Provinces of Central America had split into republics. These include El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the Honduras. All right, they had a conservative clergy and wealthy landowners resisted liberal democratic reforms. All right, and they couldn't really agree in terms of a canal, how much it would cost. It was needed for revenue. They really couldn't come to, any kind of real agreement on it. So between 1820 and 1850, we see a lot of new nations forming and new groups forming. We talked about Gran Colombia and the United Provinces of Central America. There's a lot of instability, though, and internal struggle between liberal and conservative views. So you end up with like 60 revolts in Bolivia, 52 revolts and coups. Remember, coup is that term that means a blow to the state where the military seizes control. 52 revolts and coups in Venezuela. Liberals wanted free trade, representative government, and a federal system of government that divided power between states and the central government, whereas conservatives wanted to protect the church, and they kind of looked out more for those upper class, like, Creoles and that were closer to the top of the hierarchy. The conservatives are going to control most of the regimes between 1830 and 1870. The independence movements are predominantly run by Creoles. Remember, they're of mixed European and native ancestry. Born in Latin America. The Spanish administrators, though, had excluded Creoles for such a long time from political leadership that they didn't have a lot of experience running government. So they're going to run into some issues. So the military is going to step in to fill that role where the inexperienced Creoles struggle. A lot of these men are drawn from the armies that formed to fight for independence. They had organizational skills, and they gained control through support of landowners, essentially, and church officials. Remember that those Creoles, especially in your upper classes, were like, hey, we want to avoid the violence and destruction of the peasant revolt. So we're going to support these folks who are going to organize things and assert some authority so that we can keep our land, keep our power. But these leaders faced revolts and coups too. All right, so that military hierarchy helped compensate for weak civil leaders, but it wasn't without its problems. All right, so some achievements that we get is the expansion of an education system, abolishment of slavery across Latin America, establishment and stabilizing of foreign affairs, We're going to see some European involvement continue. Britain is going to establish Uruguay as a buffer between Argentina and Brazil. But the United States is going to start to get involved. So we're going to fight a war with Mexico and take the northern half of their territory. We're going to kick the Spanish out of Cuba in 1898. We're going to encourage Panama to declare independence from Colombia. So the U.S. is going to get heavily involved, for better or for worse, in Latin American affairs. All right. In the late 19th century, we see a lot of the strongman rule trending. We see liberalism, and we see commercial development. Remember that term, caudillo, a strong leader, usually a military leader. They relied on force. All right, they outlawed opposition, regulated schools, controlled newspapers. They used jail, police, and firing squads to suppress their enemies. A lot of times they were corrupt, but they did support liberal policies. We're going to see liberal governments in the late 19th century return to power. Even the strongmen often supported liberal policies. So we're going to see regular elections, although voting rights will be restricted, and so there will be democracy, though it's going to be an oligarchic democracy. You could say the same thing about the United States, though. I mean, when you think of the United States as a democracy early on, it was a pretty exclusive democracy. You know, you had to be a white male landowner to vote, then you had to be a white male to vote, then you had to be a male to vote. Women didn't get the right to vote until 1919, 1920. So we were pretty oligarchic too, if you think about it. There were barriers to participation. Commerce is going to develop significantly across Latin America. Mining industries are going to be really important. Estate agriculture is going to so we're talking about extensive, large-scale agriculture. So those plantations are going to shift to estates. We're going to see road and railroad networks be built across Latin America, and significant foreign investment, particularly by the United States. Slavery in Latin America will end in the 1880s, much later than in the United States. There will be a new demand for labor, all right, and there will be considerable immigration to Latin America. So, for example, in Argentina, 3/4 of its population were foreign born. So there's a lot of land and opportunity at the time. Politically, socially, because of these movements, we're going to see continued battles between liberals and conservatives and the military over how best to govern. All right, the United States goes through similar, evolutions. There's going to be tension between political forces and the masses, and you're going to see that in multiple revolts and coups and changes to governments. The government, or the economy rather, will continue to be dependent on Western-controlled economic patterns. And so what you're going to see in the late 19th and early 20th century is economic imperialism across Latin America, especially by the United States, who's going to use its larger economy to heavily influence Latin American affairs. That's going to create some issues, especially issues with our relationship with Latin American countries later on. You're going to see distinct cultural identities emerge, or reemerge rather. So there's going to be a resurgence of indigenous culture. They're going to take a good look at their colonial past and embrace racial diversity. You're going to see art and literature really reflect the cultural heritage of Latin America. But that social structure is going to stick around. So you are going to see some, racism, and discrimination. Okay. So here it is, causes and effects broken down for you one more time. And you can pause the slides and copy that down if you haven't already. All right. And this concludes our Latin American Revolutions lecture. Make sure you guys do the guided notes. Make sure you answer the chapter questions, and make sure you do the discussion board.